Jenny-Wanda Barkmann's story cannot be understood without stepping back into the world that shaped her long before she ever set foot in Stutthof. She was born on May 30th, 1922, in Hamburg, a port city still reeling from the consequences of the First World War. Germany had lost more than a war. It had lost stability, identity, and belief in its own future. The Treaty of Versailles demanded crushing reparations. The economy spiraled into hyperinflation, and ordinary families like the Barkmanns bore the burden of national humiliation. Jenny grew up in a home where money was scarce, food was rationed, and work was never guaranteed. Her father laboured at the docks, coming home exhausted and worn, while her mother stretched every coin to keep the family afloat. Poverty left a deep mark on Jenny, but so did the cultural and political forces sweeping through Germany during her childhood. The Weimar Republic struggled to hold itself together. Riots, extremist movements, unemployment, and social fragmentation filled the news. Children were not shielded from this instability. They lived within it. Schools lacked resources, communities lacked direction, and many young Germans grew up believing that their country had been robbed of dignity. In such an atmosphere, radical ideas found fertile ground. When Jenny was 10, Adolf Hitler came to power. What followed was not simply a political transition, but an engineered transformation of society. Propaganda seeped into every aspect of daily life. Posters promoting racial ideals hung in city squares. Radios broadcast speeches portraying Hitler as Germany's saviour. Teachers delivered lessons not only in arithmetic and grammar, but in loyalty, obedience, and the purity of the German nation. Jenny entered her formative years surrounded by these messages. Whether or not she embraced Nazi ideology with passion is unknown, but it surrounded her as completely as the air she breathed. The League of German Girls and the Hitler Youth created a new model of citizenship in which service to the state replaced personal moral judgment. Girls were taught their role in building a strong nation, disciplined, orderly, devoted to the community, and willing to sacrifice for the future of the Reich. For many teenagers, especially those from struggling families, these organizations offered belonging, pride, and purpose. Even without formally joining them, Jenny absorbed their influence simply by living in a society that accepted these values as normal. As she approached adulthood, Jenny dreamt of beauty, refinement, and a life far removed from her working-class roots. She admired film actresses, fashion models, and the glamorous figures portrayed in magazines approved by the state. These aspirations were common among young women of the era, but for Jenny, they existed alongside a Germany rapidly mobilizing for war. By 1939, when she was 17, she found work in a pastry shop. It was modest employment, steady enough and respectable, but the world around her was changing far faster than her personal ambitions. The war intensified, and the SS expanded its administrative and guard corps. Positions for women opened in offices, kitchens, and concentration camps. The SS advertised these roles as stable, well-paid opportunities that offered housing, food, and the chance to serve the nation. For someone like Jenny, raised in poverty and longing for a life with new possibilities, the offer may have seemed appealing rather than sinister. The moral consequences were obscured behind nationalistic language and promises of upward mobility. By 1944, she made a decision that would define her life. She joined the SS Female Auxiliary Force. Training was brief, stern, and heavily ideological, emphasizing discipline, obedience, and the absolute dehumanization of prisoners. Compassion was treated as a flaw. Duty was paramount. A young woman with dreams of elegance stepped willingly into a system designed to crush others. And when her training ended, she received the assignment that would seal her fate. She was sent east, to the Polish countryside, to a camp named Stutthof, a place already drowning in suffering. Stutthof was the first concentration camp established outside pre-war German borders, founded in 1939 when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. It began as a small detention facility for political prisoners and rapidly grew into a complex with dozens of subcamps, a forced labor system, and eventually the machinery of extermination. By the time Jenny arrived in early 1944, Stutthof had become a microcosm of the brutality that defined Nazi occupation. The camp was overcrowded, disease-ridden, and governed by a rigid hierarchy where every guard held immense power over helpless prisoners. Jenny entered this world as an Aufseherin, a female overseer, and quickly adapted to her new environment. Survivors recalled her striking appearance. Well-groomed, composed, and unusually attentive to her presentation, even within the bleak confines of the camp. Her demeanor set her apart from some other guards. She carried herself with formality and precision, traits the SS valued. She enforced discipline strictly, often more strictly than necessary. Prisoners described her as distant, authoritarian, and unwavering in her commitment to the camp's rules. Her authority extended over roll calls, labor assignments, and daily monitoring of the women's barracks. These duties might sound administrative, but in a concentration camp, they were matters of life and death. The SS created a system in which cruelty was rewarded and empathy discouraged. Guards were encouraged to view prisoners not as individuals, but as obstacles to be controlled. Stutthof operated under constant pressure. Demands for labor increased, supplies dwindled, and disease spread relentlessly. The winter of 1944-45 was particularly devastating. Typhus outbreaks swept through the camp, and prisoners weakened from starvation, and the camp lacked the medical resources to respond. Testimonies from survivors indicate that Jenny continued to enforce regulations with unwavering rigidity even as the suffering intensified. Her actions during this period shaped the image that would follow her long after the war. She was not a high-ranking official or a policymaker. She was not responsible for designing the system, but she served it actively and without resistance. She participated in selections where prisoners were evaluated for labor or transport, decisions that often predetermined life or death. She maintained camp discipline during periods when chaos threatened to destabilize the entire system, and she carried out her role with a composure that survivors found chilling. By January 1945, Soviet forces were approaching the Baltic coast. The SS ordered the evacuation of Stutthof and its subcamps. Tens of thousands of prisoners were forced on death marches in extreme winter conditions. Many perished along the way. The guards' responsibilities became inconsistent. Some fled, others escorted marches, and many abandoned their posts altogether. Jenny did not join the evacuations in an official capacity. Instead, she fled the camp and attempted to hide among civilians as the Third Reich collapsed. For months, she disappeared into a Germany in ruins. Cities were bombed to rubble, roads were filled with refugees, and the once powerful institutions of the Nazi state were disintegrating. But the war's end did not mean freedom for those who had participated in its darkest crimes. Local militias and liberated populations were determined to track down perpetrators. In May 1945, Jenny was recognized and arrested at the Gdańsk railway station. She was still young, only 23, but already deeply entangled in a history that the world would neither forget nor forgive. From that moment, Jenny's story shifted from power to judgment, from the authority of a uniform to the accountability of a courtroom. Her actions at Stutthof, once shielded by ideology, would now be scrutinized publicly and relentlessly. When Jenny-Wanda Barkmann stood in the courtroom in Gdańsk in 1946, she was no longer an overseer enforcing discipline, but a defendant facing the consequences of her choices. The Stutthof trials were among the first post-war proceedings aimed at addressing the atrocities committed in Poland. They were not designed merely to punish. They were intended to establish truth, document crimes, and restore dignity to survivors whose voices had been silenced during the occupation. The proceedings were somber and meticulous. Survivors recounted their experiences with clarity sharpened by trauma. They spoke of Jenny's demeanor, her strict enforcement of rules, and her presence during pivotal moments in camp operations. Their memories described not only individual acts, but a pattern of behavior that reflected a willingness to participate in a system built on dehumanization. Jenny listened to these testimonies with an expression that observers described as composed, detached, and almost indifferent. She maintained a careful appearance during the trial, arriving neatly dressed and poised, as though the courtroom were an inconvenience rather than the setting of her judgment. Unlike some defendants who broke down or attempted to justify their actions, Jenny offered limited explanations. She denied some accusations while minimizing others. There was no public display of remorse. Perhaps she believed the system she served would shield her. Perhaps she believed that the past could be separated from her present. But the evidence brought forward, documents, testimonies, and the collective memory of those who lived under her authority, spoke loudly. The court found her guilty of crimes against humanity. The sentence was death. On July 4, 1946, Jenny was taken to Biskupia Gorka Hill along with 10 other condemned individuals. The location was symbolic. It overlooked a city scarred by occupation, resistance, and the unimaginable losses suffered during the war. Thousands gathered, not out of hunger for spectacle, but out of a need for closure. Families who had lost loved ones, survivors who had endured the camps, and citizens determined to rebuild a free nation stood together to witness justice carried out. Jenny remained composed, even at the gallows. Her final recorded comment, made days earlier, reflected how detached she had become from the reality of her actions. Life is a pleasure, and pleasures are short. Whether these words expressed resignation, denial, or defiance is impossible to determine. But they revealed a disconnect between her experience as a perpetrator and the suffering of those she oversaw. The execution was carried out under strict supervision. When it was over, a profound quiet settled over the hillside. For many, it was not a moment of triumph, but a solemn acknowledgement of a chapter that could finally be closed. The memory of suffering could not be erased, but the acknowledgement of responsibility had been made public and undeniable. In the weeks that followed, the bodies of the condemned were taken to local medical institutions for study, as was customary at the time. Jenny's name faded from public discourse, but her story persisted in survivor testimonies, trial records, and historical studies of Stutthof. What remains today is not a portrait of a mastermind or a powerful architect of evil, but a chilling example of how ordinary individuals can become enthusiastic participants in systems of oppression when ideology replaces conscience. The case of Jenny-Wanda Barkmann forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. Cruelty does not always originate with fanatics or leaders. It can grow in the hearts of those who seek belonging, recognition, or authority, and who abandon moral judgment in exchange for power. Her story reminds us that history's darkest chapters are written not only by those who command armies, but by those who carry out orders without questioning the humanity of others. As the people dispersed from Biskupia Gorka Hill on that warm July day, they carried a message that echoes through generations. To remember is to protect the future, and to understand the past is to guard against repeating it.